And so we can see there's a big link there with our emotional health, our physical health, but there's also another branch that runs from the heart up to the face that we call our social engagement system. And this has to do with how we connect with other people. So it has a relational aspect to it as well. You know, we often think our nervous system is just what's inside of us, but it's actually always responding to the people we're around and the environments that we're in as well. But interestingly, with the vagus nerve, most of its information is going from the body up to the brain. So it has a really specific role in telling us if we're under threat or not. And then the brain will respond, and then we get a different state of our nervous system that we might move into.
Jessica McGuire is a highly experienced physiotherapist with over 13 years of experience. She's also a TED speaker and an international published author, specializing in the nervous system. Hello, Jessica.
Hello, Dana.
So nice to see you. So how did you start your journey with the nervous system?
Well, it goes back about 22 years ago, actually, when I first studied a Bachelor of Health Science at university. And then I went on to study a Master's of Physiotherapy. And a lot of the science that I was learning was looking at the way that the body and the brain were talking to each other. And I think it's really interesting because often if we're, say, a physiotherapist, we say, well, I work with the body. But if we're working more as, say, a psychologist, we might say, well, I work with the brain. But what we see now more and more is that it's really about the way that these two are connecting and communicating that governs the responses through our whole system. And so a lot of the patients that were coming to see me had persistent pain, but they were really presenting with more like a cluster of symptoms. So it would be something like chronic pain, digestive issues, they weren't sleeping, and they had anxiety. And I felt like I was just looking at this iceberg above the surface of the water. And, you know, they'd go through an emotional period and then their symptoms would get worse. And I wanted to work with what was going on below the surface of the water. So I really focused on understanding the way that the brain and the body were communicating. And that really is the nervous system. Particularly seeing the vagus nerve's connection between the brain and body. And so I focused a lot of my study there. I really worked looking at what's known as transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation as well. And I started sharing the science with my patients in workshops. And then those workshops quickly took off and sold. And then we started sharing things online, and that's where we are today. So we've been helping people from all around the world for about the last 6 years online.
Oh, wow. And for people who don't know, could you tell us a little bit about the role of the vagus nerve system?
Yes, of course. So when we look at the vagus nerve's anatomy, it's really helpful because it gives us an idea of what it actually does. And it's helpful to place one hand on the back of the head at the base of the skull there. And that's where it starts. And it first of all comes down to the heart. So there's a connection there. And this plays a really big role in regulating our physiology and our emotions as well. And we might say this acts as a little bit like a brake. So when we feel that there's something stressful happening, this part of our vagus nerve can slow us back down so that we can cope with, but also recover from stress. And then the other part of the vagus nerve runs from the base of the skull right down to the bottom of our belly, so down to the colon. And that has a role in regulating our organs, so keeping our organs in balance. And so we can see there's a big link there with our emotional health, our physical health, but there's also another branch that runs from the heart up to the face that we call our social engagement system. And this has to do with how we connect with other people. So it has a relational aspect to it as well. You know, we often think our nervous system is just what's inside of us, but it's actually always responding to the people we're around and the environments that we're in as well. But interestingly, with the vagus nerve, most of its information is going from the body up to the brain. So it has a really specific role in telling us if we're under threat or not. And then the brain will respond, and then we get a different state of our nervous system that we might move into.
Uh-huh. And how can we tie it to the sympathetic and parasympathetic system?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. We used to just look at the nervous system as having like two branches. So we had sympathetic, which was like the mobilization or what speeds us up, a little bit like the accelerator or the gas in a car. And then the parasympathetic, we used to think of as just being like the brake, where we slow down. It was often called rest and digest. But thanks to the incredible work of Dr. Stephen Porges, we realized that the parasympathetic branch, which is largely made up of the vagus nerve, actually takes us into two responses. So it's still aiming to slow us down, where it might be, like I said, that branch running from the brain to the heart that brings our physiology back down and keeps that sympathetic activation in check. But what Dr. Stephen Porges found was that under extreme levels of stress, we actually can slow down so much that we shut down and we come into a state of collapse, or we might freeze. And it's really interesting because I think as a society, you know, we really understand why when someone's under threat, they might fight or they might run away, but we probably don't really understand why people freeze or collapse or shut down. And we might even judge them a little bit for that, you know, and say, well, they should have spoken up or they should have
Yes.
taken action. So it's given a lot of insight for people who've been through traumatic stress, or even just chronic stress that doesn't, you know, have a period of recovery, as to why people might find themselves moving into a state of shutdown or freeze in the short term, or over the long term, that state where their nervous system is flat. They feel depressed, they feel burnt out. There's a lot of fatigue there. And it gives us a lot of insight and understanding as to why people may feel the way they do.
And many of my listeners have children with the difficulties regulating the nervous system. So would you say it's bad to feel angry?
It's such a good question. And this is like one of my little pet peeves, because I actually get a little bit annoyed, or I get a little bit angry myself when we hear this message that regulation is about being calm all the time. And it's definitely not what we're aiming for. So, you know, the key to learning this work and learning about the nervous system and regulation is so that we have this capacity to contain these emotions, but it's not trying to suppress them. You know, it's very healthy to feel anger if somebody's overstepped a boundary or if somebody's done something wrong. And that anger can help us. You know, anger comes from the sympathetic branch of our nervous system, that mobilization or that fight or flight energy. And that is the same branch that brings us strength, mastery, agency, autonomy. It gives us our focus and our power. So we're not trying to just stay at one level all the time. What we're really looking to do is to match what's happening in our environment with the correct amount of activation in our nervous system. So that might mean, okay, well, this is what's happening. Somebody is, you know, overstepping the mark. I need to take an action. Or if somebody was threatening, I need to get out of there. But I think with children, you know, there's ways where, and I have a 14-month-old daughter, so I'm very familiar with big emotions. we're not trying to squash their big emotions. We're trying to help them to feel them. And, babies aren't born with this ability to self-regulate. They need their parents to help them to do that. And that's very much that is a big part of my role in motherhood. Is like this morning is the perfect example of when I was leaving to go to work. My daughter was upset and she didn't want me to go to work. So, there's part of that where we learn to help them be with their feelings and be with their inner world. And that's what nervous system work is about for us as adults too.
So for older kids, what would be your tips for having a flexible nervous system?
It's a great question. So children if we're looking to change their brain or their nervous system, play is the ultimate, because play is really where we are getting the mobilization in their nervous system, but it's kept in check by the vagus nerve. So if we look at the different states of the nervous system, we can technically say there are 3 states. It's a little bit like saying, we have primary colors. So we can say the regulated state, we could say that's green, and that's where we feel fairly calm, or we can be with whatever emotions are coming up. We're not overwhelmed by them. And then our sympathetic state is where we have mobilization, and that can be fight or flight, but it doesn't have to be that we get anxious. It can just be that energy we feel in our nervous system. And then the 3rd state is the red state. We could say that's where we get more of a collapse, shut down, freeze, but that's where we get energy immobilization. So our energy drops. So play is actually blending the first 2 states together. It's a little bit like mixing 2 colors of paint together. And so in that state of play, that's what's teaching us to be able to let this mobilization come into our nervous system and activate our vagus nerve so it is kept in check. Now, if we're talking about older children, there is a lot with movement that's wonderful. So when we're looking at movement that kids absolutely love and that they feel that come into their system, and it's almost like you could look at this as peak performance, like where if it was like a sport type thing, and then slow that back down. But again, this would depend as well on the like the ability of the child as well. You'd want to match that to what they could cope with. And for some children, that might just be a game where there is mobilization, then the brake comes back on. Mobilization, then it slows down again. When there's back and forth, or reciprocity with talking, listening, or even turn taking, that teaches that as well. So that's really wonderful. But a lot of this comes from the sensory systems of the body, right? And the vagus nerve plays a big role in interoception, which is the sense of the inner world of the body. And so when you can teach children to notice the sensations in their body in conjunction with play, you're really helping build that regulation as well. And again, it depends on the child, but lots of those around movement, play, music is so wonderful as well in that instance.
And with children who have difficulties regulating themselves, what would be your first tip?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think why I love interoception so much is because we are looking at regulation in 2 ways. We're looking at regulation in terms of bodily states. So that can be things like noticing thirst, getting a drink, noticing the need to use the bathroom, going to the bathroom, noticing hunger, eating food. They are quick, easy ways that kids can regulate. Sometimes that might mean that they need outside, enforcement to help them notice those cues, but to teach them how to read those bodily signals and then take the action. The other part of that fits in with emotional regulation, where we teach kids to recognize early on, when my jaw gets tight, when my hands come into fists, I'm getting angry. And it really is two or more bodily signals that tell us what an emotion is. So if we can teach kids, anxiety might be the tightness in the chest, it might be the clammy palms, it might be the feeling of our shoulders tightening up, and they can say, okay, I recognize this is anxiety from these bodily signals. What is the action that helps me when I feel anxious? And that might be that I talk to a grown-up if that's, appropriate.
Yeah.
It might mean that I need to get up and move. So we can look at it as both bodily states and emotional states that kids need. We all need to cultivate that regulation, and combining that in with play and movement. But I think with children, it's really giving them permission to have autonomy and agency, rather than, it's hard because they sit so much when they need a lot of movement as well.
Yes. And how would you say that the neurotransmitters are connected to our vagal system?
Yeah, this is a really great question. It's quite a complex one, isn't it?
Yes.
But we can see that with acetylcholine, which is a really important, it's really important for both our body and our brain, but the vagus nerve actually releases acetylcholine that's used at the heart, and that is what slows us back down. But we know that acetylcholine also plays a really important role in neuroplasticity and changing the brain. So like the focus that we can get when we are in a state where the vagus nerve is active is really important. And, we can see this as a full loop between the body and brain. We're not just looking at what's happening, that neurotransmitters in the brain solely, it's also in the body. And we know that the vagus nerve is communicating directly with the gut to the brain. So we can look at the neurotransmitters that play a role in that as well. It's really interesting that that's what is now being shown in the science as what's connecting, thought to, still looking at the research, but thought to be the connection of those signals from directly in the gut to the brain. And I think that's a really exciting place for us to see, because we can see that we need a bigger picture of how we look at health than just looking at the brain. We also need to look at things like the gut. We need to look at things like exercise, nutrition, how we're really taking care of ourselves as a whole person. So yes, it plays a very big role in communication, but particularly in acetylcholine. And this is what's really interesting to see in the science with vagus nerve stimulation to the ear and how that's improving things like neuroplasticity.
Exactly. So in your course, do you use different devices that help stimulate the vagus nerve?
That's part of the more advanced courses, but our main things that we begin with is teaching people to really be like tune into their interoception and recognize the states that they're in, and then how to guide themselves back to regulation, that state. And once people can spend more time in that state of regulation, that's where we see the greatest improvements to emotional regulation, brain health, and also to the body's health as well. Things like the immune system, the endocrine system, it benefits them all.
So would the course be suitable for parents or for practitioners?
It's actually both. So we've made them accessible for all. We have like 50% of people who do our trainings are health practitioners or health and wellness. They might be doing something like massage or yoga teaching, but the other 50% is for people who are doing it for themselves, and very much so parents who are doing this for their children. And I think, for parents with children that they may have some challenges with regulation, there can often need to be for the parents themselves
course.
care as well with to be a co-regulator, and that's a big part of what we teach, because we can only co-regulate for our children if we're in that state of regulation ourselves. It's very hard if we're anxious or we're feeling flat and shut down, isn't it?
Exactly. I think it's such an important message for all parents out there to look after themselves first.
Yes, totally. Yeah, it can be hard. I really feel for, as a parent now myself, I really recognize the challenges that come with taking care of ourselves, when there's so much to do.
Yes, exactly. So how could parents contact you and learn more about your course?
So that everything is laid out on my website, jessicamcguire.com. Our vagus nerve masterclass is a great starting point. It's a 3-hour training that covers everything, gives the resources to get started with. These can be adapted for children as well.
Oh, wow, that's great. And if they want to continue learning, so they go to the second course, right?
Yes, then we have our 8-week vagus nerve program, and that's much more extensive, and that's based on the principles of neuroplasticity. So it's really about transforming the nervous system. And then for those people who want to then take it further and use this work for themselves to help others, then we have our nervous system certification course as well.
Oh, wow. Jessica, thank you so much for giving my audience so much information, and I'm looking forward to joining you on one of your courses.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to chat with you.
Oh, thank you again.